My name is Elena Varelli, and 3 nights ago, I turned 18. At my birthday dinner, right when the candles melted into wax and everyone started pretending things were normal, my mother leaned close to me and said quietly, "After dessert, we'll need you to sign a few documents. It's just something your grandfather arranged." I smiled like I always do. I nodded like I always do. But something in her voice felt rehearsed. So instead of going back to the table, I excused myself, walked upstairs to my room, locked the door, and opened the folder my grandfather had given me 2 years ago. The one he told me to never touch unless something felt wrong. That night, for the first time, something felt very wrong. Inside were instructions, legal contacts, account details I didn't even know existed, and one handwritten note that simply said, asterisk, "If they rush you, don't trust them." Asterisk, so I didn't. Instead, I called the number listed at the bottom of the page. Within 40 minutes, everything changed. By midnight, every asset tied to my name, every property, every account, every share had been transferred into a protected structure that no one could access without my explicit approval. Not even my parents. The next morning, I found out exactly why that mattered. My father didn't knock before entering my room. He never does. But this time, he wasn't calm. He wasn't composed. He looked panicked. "Elena," he said, trying to sound controlled, "we need to fix something. There's been a misunderstanding with your accounts." I sat up slowly. "What kind of misunderstanding?" "The kind you correct by signing what we asked you to sign last night." I tilted my head slightly. "I already took care of my accounts." That's when everything went silent. My mother stepped into the room behind him. My younger brother hovered in the hallway, confused but watching closely. No one spoke for a moment. Then my father asked, very carefully, "What do you mean you took care of it?" I held his gaze. "I mean everything is secured, legally, permanently." His face changed. Not anger, not yet. Fear. That was the moment I realized something I should have understood years ago. This was never about helping me. This was about control. Before I tell you what happened next, let me take you back to a summer 6 years ago. The summer everything actually started. I was 12 when my grandfather, Lorenzo Varelli, took me away for the summer to stay at his estate by the coast. At the time, I thought it was just a vacation. A break from school, from pressure, from the constant tension at home I couldn't quite explain. But it wasn't a vacation. It was preparation. Every morning he would sit me down with papers, real documents, contracts, financial summaries, and ask me simple questions. "What do you think this means? Who benefits here? What would you do differently?" At first, I didn't understand any of it. But he never rushed me, never corrected me immediately. He just watched how I thought. One afternoon, while we were sitting on the terrace overlooking the water, he said something that stayed with me, even if I didn't fully understand it at the time. "Trust isn't what people say, Elena. It's what they do when they think you're not paying attention." I remember laughing it off. I wish I hadn't. Because that same evening, I overheard a phone call I wasn't meant to hear. My father's voice, low, irritated. "She's just a child. You're overcomplicating this. When the time comes, we'll handle it." I didn't know what it was. But my grandfather did. The next day, he changed everything. That's when he gave me the folder. That's when he started teaching me not just how money works, but how people behave around it. "Everyone thinks inheritance is a gift," he told me once. "It's not. It's a test. And most people fail it." Years passed. Life moved on. And I almost forgot about those lessons. Until my 18th birthday. Until the documents. Until the urgency in my mother's voice. Back in the present, standing in my room, watching my parents try to regain control of a situation that was slipping through their fingers, I finally understood what my grandfather had been preparing me for. "You shouldn't have done that," my mother said, her voice tightening. "I should have done it sooner," I replied. My father stepped closer. "You don't understand the consequences of this." "No," I said calmly. "I think I finally do." What followed wasn't an argument. It was a revelation. Within hours, calls were being made. Lawyers were involved. My uncle, who later discovered had already begun negotiating sales of assets that were never legally his, started demanding explanations. But there was nothing they could do. Everything was sealed, protected, untouchable. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to their decisions. They were reacting to mine. That night, I sat alone in my room, holding my grandfather's note again. Asterisk. If they rush you, don't trust them. Asterisk. I used to think that was just advice. Now I understood it was a warning. The truth didn't come all at once. It unfolded slowly over the next few days. Documents surfaced. Intentions became clear. Plans I was never supposed to know about came to light. And every piece confirmed the same thing. I hadn't overreacted. I had just acted in time. A week later, I left the house. Not because I was forced to, but because I finally had the choice. And as I stepped outside, into a future that no longer felt controlled or predetermined, I realized something else my grandfather had tried to teach me all those years ago. Power isn't about having everything. It's about making sure no one can take what's yours without your consent. And for the first time in my life, I had that power. The first night in the apartment felt unfamiliar in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't the size, it was smaller than the house, obviously. It wasn't the silence either. If anything, there was more noise here. Distant traffic. Someone walking upstairs. A door closing down the hall. It was the absence of tension. For the first time in years, I wasn't listening for footsteps outside my door. I wasn't waiting for someone to call my name with that controlled urgency that always meant something was about to be taken from me. My time, my choices, my voice. I sat on the floor instead of the couch. I hadn't unpacked everything yet. Boxes were still stacked near the walls, labeled in careful handwriting that felt like it belonged to someone more organized than I actually was. On top of one of those boxes sat the folder. I had brought it with me, not because I needed it anymore, but because it reminded me of the moment everything changed. My phone buzzed against the hardwood beside me, pulling me out of my thoughts. I didn't have to check to know who it was. I let it ring once, twice. Then I picked it up. "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end. Not the kind filled with hesitation, but the kind filled with calculation. "Elena," my father's voice said finally, smoother now than it had been days ago. Controlled again. Reconstructed. "I think it's time we had a proper conversation." I leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. "We've had several." "No," he replied. "We've had reactions. This needs to be a discussion." I almost smiled at that. "A discussion implies honesty," I said. "I'm not sure that's something we've practiced." Another pause. "You've made your point," he continued, ignoring what I said. "That this doesn't have to become permanent." There it was, not an apology. A negotiation. "It already is permanent," I said calmly. "Legally. Legality can be adjusted." "No," I said, my voice quieter now but sharper. "It really can't." "No," I said, my voice quieter now but sharper. "It really can't." For a moment I thought he might lose control again, that the anger I had seen before would surface, but it didn't. Instead, He changed tactics. "You're isolating yourself," he said. "You walked away from your family over a misunderstanding." I closed my eyes. A misunderstanding doesn't involve pre-drafted documents and urgency timed to a birthday dinner. You're too young to see the full picture, and you didn't expect me to see any of it. Silence. This time, it lingered longer. When he spoke again, the warmth in his voice was gone. "You're making a mistake. I learned from yours." I ended the call before he could respond. The quiet that followed felt different from the silence in the mansion. This one didn't press down on me. It didn't feel like something was hiding inside it. It felt open. That didn't mean everything was over. If anything, it was just beginning. 2 days later, I met with the lawyer my grandfather had connected me to years ago. Her office overlooked the city, all glass and clean lines. The kind of place designed to make everything feel transparent, even when it wasn't. She didn't waste time. "They're restructuring," she said, sliding a document across the desk toward me. "Not illegally, not yet. But they're repositioning assets around the ones they can no longer access." I skimmed the page, recognizing names, properties, fragments of a system I had only recently begun to fully understand. "Can they touch anything that's under my control?" "No," she said simply. "That part is airtight. Your grandfather made sure of it." I nodded slowly. "And the rest?" She leaned back slightly, studying me in a way that felt familiar. Evaluating. Measuring. "The rest," she said, "depends on how involved you want to be." I looked down at the papers again. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have even understood what I was looking at. Now I could see the patterns, the pressure points, the intentions behind the movements. "They're trying to recover control," I said. "Yes, and they think I'll step back." She didn't answer that. She didn't have to. I exhaled slowly, then met her gaze. "Then I don't step back." Something shifted in her expression, not surprise, exactly. More like confirmation. "All right," she said. "Then we proceed accordingly." That afternoon marked the second turning point. The first had been securing what was mine. The second was deciding what to do with it. Over the next week, I stopped reacting entirely. I didn't answer calls. I didn't respond to messages. I didn't engage in anything that wasn't structured, documented, intentional. And in that silence, something interesting happened. They got louder. Emails became longer, more emotional, then colder, then more formal. Requests turned into demands. Demands turned into threats, carefully worded, of course. Always framed in a way that maintained plausible deniability. But the meaning was clear. They weren't used to being on the outside. And they didn't know how to handle it. One evening, as I was reviewing a set of reports at the small dining table that doubled as my workspace, there was a knock at the door. I froze. Not out of fear. Out of instinct. No one came here unannounced. Slowly, I stood and walked toward the door, my mind already running through possibilities. When I opened it, I wasn't surprised. My mother stood in the hallway. Alone. She looked different. Not weaker. Just less certain. "Elena," she said softly. I didn't move aside. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you. You've seen me." Her expression tightened slightly, but she didn't push past me. "Can I come in?" "No." The word came out before I could soften it. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I finally understood something I hadn't before. Access is a form of control, and I was done giving it away without thinking. She nodded slowly, accepting it more easily than I expected. "I won't take much of your time," she said. "I just wanted to explain." I crossed my arms lightly. Then explain. For a moment, she looked like she might try to construct some version of the truth that was easier to say. But then she stopped. And what came next wasn't polished. It wasn't strategic. It was honest. We didn't think you'd be ready, she said. I frowned slightly. Ready for what? For responsibility. For the complexity of everything your grandfather left behind. So your solution was to take it before I could understand it. Her eyes flickered. To manage it. That's not what the document said. She didn't argue with that, because she couldn't. The hallway felt quieter now. Even the distant sounds from other apartments seemed to fade. We thought we were protecting you, she said finally. I held her gaze. No, I said. You were protecting your access. The words landed harder than I expected them to. Not because they were harsh, but because they were true. She looked down for a moment, then back at me. And what happens now? She asked. It was a simple question, but it carried everything behind it. Years of assumptions, control, distance, decisions made without me. I thought about it carefully before answering. Now, I said, things are clear. She waited. And clarity doesn't go away just because it's uncomfortable. For a second, I saw something shift in her expression. Not defeat. Not acceptance. Understanding. It wasn't complete. But it was there. She nodded once. Then, without another word, she turned and walked down the hall. I closed the door quietly. And for a long moment I just stood there. Not relieved. Not victorious. Just steady. Because this wasn't about winning. It never had been. It was about seeing things as they actually were. And deciding, finally, what I was going to do about it. I walked back to the table, sat down, and pulled the documents closer. There was still work to do. And this time, I wasn't doing it for anyone else. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I had somewhere urgent to be, but because my mind refused to stay still. It kept moving, connecting pieces, replaying conversations, anticipating outcomes that hadn't happened yet. For years, everything in my life had been reactive. Decisions were made around me, and I adjusted accordingly. But now, there was no script to follow. Only choices. I made coffee in a kitchen that still felt temporary, leaning against the counter, as the city slowly came to life outside the window. There was something grounding about doing simple things on my own terms. No expectations attached. No one watching. Just quiet ownership of small moments. By the time I sat down at the table, my phone already had 3 new emails. All of them were from people I had never spoken to directly before, but recognized immediately from documents I had reviewed over the past week. Advisors, managers, people who had always operated one layer above me, assuming they never needed to deal with me at all. Until now. The tone of the messages was careful, professional, but underneath it, there was uncertainty. They didn't know who I was yet. They didn't know how I would respond. And that gave me an advantage I hadn't expected. I opened the first email slowly, reading every line, not just for information, but for intent. What they were asking. What they weren't saying. What they assumed I wouldn't question. Then I replied. Short, direct, precise. No emotion. No unnecessary explanations. Just clarity. By the time I finished responding to the third message, something had shifted again. Not around me. Inside me. I wasn't just holding control anymore. I was using it. Later that afternoon, I returned to the lawyer's office. This time, I didn't wait to be guided through the conversation. I want full visibility, I said as soon as we sat down. Not summaries, not filtered reports. Everything. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. That's going to require restructuring how information flows to you. Then we restructure it, and it will put you in direct contact with people who are used to operating independently. I didn't hesitate. Then they adjust. There was no arrogance in the words, just certainty. Because I had already seen what happened when I stayed passive. I wasn't going back to that. Over the next few days, the changes began. Access points shifted, reporting lines adjusted. People who had never needed my approval before suddenly found themselves waiting for it. And with each decision, I learned something new. Not just about the system, but about the people inside it. Some adapted quickly, efficient, professional, focused on maintaining stability. Others resisted subtly at first. Delays, vague responses, small attempts to maintain control in areas they thought I wouldn't notice. They underestimated how closely I was paying attention. By the end of the week, patterns had already formed. Trust wasn't based on titles. It was based on behavior. Exactly like my grandfather had said. One evening, as I was reviewing a set of financial summaries that finally made complete sense to me, I came across something that didn't fit. It was small, easy to overlook. A minor allocation, buried under layers of larger transactions. But it didn't align with the rest. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the numbers. Then I pulled up previous reports. The same pattern appeared. Not identical but consistent enough to matter. I felt that same quiet instinct I had the night of my birthday. Something isn't right. The difference now was that I knew what to do with that feeling. The next morning I requested a meeting, not with my lawyer, with the person responsible for that section of the reports. His name was Adrian Keller. Mid-level. Experienced. Quiet reputation for being reliable. He arrived exactly on time. Composed. Respectful. Slightly cautious. "Miss Varelli," he said as he took a seat across from me. "Elena," I corrected. He nodded once. "Elena." I slid the documents across the table. "Walk me through this." He glanced down, scanning the page quickly. "It's a standard allocation adjustment," he said. "Nothing unusual." "It's not standard," I replied. He paused, then looked up. "Which part concerns you?" I leaned forward slightly. "The part where it repeats just enough to disappear into everything else." Silence, not long, but long enough. "I'd like a detailed explanation," I added. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Not defensive. "Careful. I'll need to pull additional records," he said. "You'll have them by when?" "End of day." "Good." The meeting ended there. Clean. Controlled. But as he left the room, I knew something had changed. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. By evening, the report he sent was thorough, organized, technically correct, and still incomplete. I read it twice, then a third time, and the same conclusion settled in. He wasn't lying, but he wasn't telling me everything. The next step wasn't confrontation. It was confirmation. Over the following days, I expanded the scope quietly, requested parallel reports, cross-checked timelines, connected details that weren't meant to be connected. And slowly, the picture became clearer. It wasn't a large-scale operation. Not yet. But it was intentional, controlled, designed to stay unnoticed unless someone was looking directly at it. And now I was. I sat back, staring at the final set of compiled information spread across my table. There it was, not a suspicion anymore, a fact. For a brief moment, I considered what the old version of me would have done. Ignored it, doubted myself, waited for someone else to confirm it first. But that version of me didn't exist anymore. I picked up my phone and made the call. "Schedule a meeting," I said when the line connected. "Tomorrow morning." "With who?" my assistant asked. I looked down at the name on the report. Adrian Keller. There was a pause. Then, "Understood." As I ended the call, I felt something settle into place. Not tension. Not anger. Control, because this time whatever was happening wasn't going to stay hidden. And neither was I. The meeting was scheduled for 9. He arrived at 8:58. Early enough to show respect. Not early enough to suggest anxiety. That told me something before he even sat down. "Good morning," Adrian said, taking his seat across from me with the same controlled composure he'd shown before. "Morning," I replied, sliding a thinner folder across the table this time. "Let's keep this simple." He didn't touch the folder right away. Instead, he looked at me, waiting, careful. "I reviewed your report," I continued. "It was structured well, clear, technically accurate." A slight nod. "Thank you." I held his gaze. It just wasn't complete. That was the first moment his expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. "I'm not sure I understand," he said. I opened the folder and turned it toward him, tapping lightly on a section he hadn't included in his version. "Then let me help." He looked down, and this time, the silence lasted longer. Because there it was. Not hidden anymore. Connected. Aligned in a way that removed any room for interpretation. A series of small reallocations, individually insignificant, layered over time to redirect value without triggering alerts. Clean. Subtle. Intentional. When he finally looked back up, the composure was still there. But now it was working harder. "You went deeper than most would," he said. "I'm not most." "No," he agreed quietly. "You're not." Another pause. Different this time. Less defensive. More measured. "I'd like to hear your explanation," I said. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, not frustration, not quite resignation either. "Calculation. There are 2 versions," he said. "The simple one and the honest one." "I don't have time for the simple one." Something almost like respect flickered across his expression. "All right," he said. "Then I'll give you the honest one." He folded his hands loosely on the table. "This started before you turned 18. I didn't react. Didn't interrupt. Not as a scheme," he continued. "As a contingency. For who? For the people who assumed control would remain predictable. My parents. Yes." The word landed flat. Expected. And still. Hearing it said out loud changed something. "They wanted flexibility," he went on. "Unrestricted movement in certain areas. Nothing that would raise legal concerns, but enough to maintain influence regardless of how assets were formally structured. And you helped them do that." I executed instructions that were presented as internal strategy. That's a careful way of saying it. It's an accurate way of saying it. I studied him for a moment. "You knew." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Yes." The honesty didn't feel defensive. It felt deliberate. "Why continue after everything changed?" I asked. "After it became clear they no longer had access." His answer came faster than I expected. "Because systems don't stop the moment ownership shifts," he said. "They carry momentum. People follow patterns longer than they should." "And you?" I was waiting to see if you would notice. That wasn't the answer I expected. "Why?" "Because that determines what happens next." The room went still. Not tense. focused. You're saying this was a test. I'm saying this was a threshold. I leaned back slightly, letting that settle. Then, no positioning. I nodded once. Good. Then start from the beginning. And he did. What unfolded over the next hour wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was precise. Layered. A system built not on large acts of deception, but on small, controlled adjustments that relied on one thing above all else. Assumption. The assumption that no one would look closely enough. The assumption that even if someone did, they wouldn't understand what they were seeing. The assumption that control, once established, wouldn't be challenged. They were wrong. When he finished, the room felt quieter than before. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything had been said. I closed the folder slowly. "All right," I said. He waited, not tense, not defensive. Just ready. "Here's what's going to happen." His attention sharpened. "You're going to document everything," I continued. "Every instruction, every adjustment, every point of origin." He nodded once. "You're going to identify who was involved, directly and indirectly." Another nod. "And then," I said, my voice steady, "you're going to help me dismantle it." That was the first time something close to surprise showed on his face. Not resistance. Just a recalibration. "You want to expose it." "I want to understand it completely," I corrected. "Exposure is just a consequence of that." He considered that. Then slowly he nodded. "Understood." I stood, signaling the meeting was over. But as he reached the door, I spoke again. "Adrian." He paused, turning slightly. "This doesn't make you safe," I said. "It makes you accountable." "I'm aware," he replied. "Good." He held my gaze for a second longer. Then he left. When the door closed, I exhaled quietly, not out of relief, out of clarity. Because now, there were no unknowns left in this part of the system. Only decisions and consequences. I walked back to the table, looking down at the documents spread across it. A week ago, this would have overwhelmed me. Now, it felt like structure. Like something I could take apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left hidden inside it. My phone buzzed again. Another message. Another request. Another piece of a system that was still adjusting to the reality of me. I picked it up, already knowing what I was going to do. For years, everything around me had been designed to move without my input. Now, nothing moved without my awareness. And soon, nothing would move without my permission. The documentation began that same day. Not slowly. Not cautiously. Precisely. Adrian didn't disappear after the meeting, and that told me more than anything he had said. People who planned to evade accountability usually created distance-first delays, confusion, layers of misdirection. He did the opposite. By noon, the first set of internal records was already in my inbox. Time-stamped, indexed, cross-referenced, clean. Too clean, if I hadn't already known what I was looking at. I spent the next several hours going through everything line by line. Not skimming, not trusting summaries. Understanding. That was the difference now. Patterns that once looked like noise started forming structure. Decisions that seemed isolated revealed sequences. And behind every sequence, intent. By late evening, I had mapped out the first layer. Not the full system, but enough to see its shape, and more importantly, enough to see where it connected to people I hadn't confronted yet. I didn't call anyone that night, didn't send messages, didn't react. Because reacting too early would only push everything back into the shadows. Instead, I waited. The next morning I expanded the circle. 3 more meetings. Different departments. Different roles. Same question beneath all of them. Who knew and when? The answers varied. Some were genuinely unaware, their involvement limited to isolated tasks with no visibility beyond their scope. Others knew just enough to avoid asking questions. And a few, a very small few, knew exactly what they were doing. Those were the ones I focused on, not immediately, but deliberately. By the end of the 3rd day, I had something I didn't have before. Leverage. Not loud. Not aggressive. Quiet. Documented. Irrefutable. That's when the tone around me started to shift again. Not in the open. In the margins. Responses became faster. More careful. Language changed. Less assumption. More precision. People were adjusting not because they had been told to, because they could feel it. The system was no longer operating the way it used to. And they didn't know exactly why. Only that something had changed. On the 4th day, I received a message I had been expecting. Not from my father. Not from my mother. From my uncle. Asterisk, we need to talk. Asterisk, no explanation. No attempt at subtlety. Just that. I looked at the message for a long moment before setting the phone down. Of course he did. Because if there was one thing I had learned through all of this, it was that control doesn't disappear quietly. It repositions. It looks for openings. And when it doesn't find any, it creates pressure. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I finished what I was working on. Reviewed one more set of reports. Sent 2 emails. Closed the loop on a detail that would have gone unnoticed a week ago. Then, finally, I picked up the phone. Asterisk tomorrow. 10 a.m. My office. Asterisk, I didn't ask. I didn't negotiate. I set the terms. His reply came less than a minute later. Asterisk, I'll be there. Asterisk. Of course he would. The next morning I arrived early. Not out of habit. Out of intention. Everything about this meeting needed to be controlled before it even began. The room was minimal glass walls, neutral tones, nothing distracting. A space designed for clarity. I placed a single folder on the table. Not everything, just enough. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door opened. He walked in without hesitation. Confident. Composed. Familiar in a way that felt almost rehearsed. Elena, he said, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sit, I replied. No greeting, no acknowledgement beyond that. He sat. Looked around briefly, taking in the space, the positioning, the absence of anything unnecessary. You've made quite an adjustment, he said. I've made necessary ones. His smile tightened slightly. I imagine this has all been overwhelming. It hasn't. He leaned back, studying me. Reassessing, because whatever version of me he expected wasn't sitting across from him. I assume this is about the recent disruptions, he said. I slid the folder toward him. It's about clarity. He opened it, and for the first time since he entered the room, he paused. Not long, but long enough. What exactly am I looking at? He asked, even though we both knew he already understood. A timeline, I said, of decisions made under the assumption I wouldn't be paying attention. His gaze lifted slowly. That's a serious implication. It's a documented one. Silence. Different from the others. Heavier. Because unlike Adrian, this wasn't someone who had been operating within a system. This was someone who had helped shape it. You're moving very quickly, he said. I'm moving precisely. And you think you understand everything already? No, I said calmly. I understand enough. He closed the folder. Carefully. Then let me offer you some perspective. I didn't respond. Didn't encourage. Just waited. Systems like this, he continued, don't function on surface-level observations. There are layers. Context you haven't experienced yet. I'm aware. Then you should also be aware that acting too early can create instability. There's already instability. Manageable instability, he corrected. What you're proposing? I haven't proposed anything yet. Another pause. This one sharper. Because now, he wasn't leading the conversation anymore. You've always been intelligent, he said, shifting tone. But intelligence without experience can be dangerous. I held his gaze. And experience without accountability is predictable. That landed. His expression didn't break. But it changed. Slightly. Enough. What do you want? He asked finally. A direct question. At last. I want the structure to reflect reality, I said. Not assumptions. And if those assumptions benefited everyone involved? They didn't. He exhaled slowly, leaning forward now, engaged in a different way. And if correcting them costs more than you expect, then it's still the cost. Silence settled between us again. But this time, it felt like a conclusion, not a pause. He tapped the folder lightly with his fingers, thinking, calculating. Then, finally, he nodded. Once, small, controlled. I see, he said. And for the first time since this conversation began, there was no attempt to redirect it, no attempt to reshape it, just acknowledgement. Not agreement, but understanding. He stood, straightened his jacket. You're right about one thing, he said. I didn't move, didn't ask. This won't stay contained, he continued. What you're doing, it expands. I know. And when it does, he added, you won't just be correcting the past. His eyes met mine. You'll be defining what comes next. I didn't look away. That's the point. A brief pause. Then he gave a small nod. Not approval. Not approval at all. Something closer to recognition. And without another word, he walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. I stayed where I was for a moment, not replaying the conversation, not second-guessing. Just still. Because that was it. The shift had happened. Not quietly, not completely, but undeniably. This was no longer about uncovering what had been done. It was about deciding what would be allowed moving forward. And for the first time, everyone involved knew it. After he left, the room didn't feel empty. It felt settled. Like something that had been circling for weeks had finally landed in one place. Clear enough to see without second-guessing. I didn't need to replay the conversation. There was nothing hidden inside it. He understood. That was enough. I gathered the folder, closed it carefully, and walked out without rushing. The hallway outside was quieter than usual, but not still. People moved, spoke in low voices, checked screens, everything normal on the surface. But the rhythm had changed. You could feel it in the timing, in the way conversations paused when I passed, in how quickly attention shifted, then shifted back again. Awareness. It wasn't announced. It spread. By the time I reached my office, there were already 2 new messages waiting. One from Adrian, one from legal. Both marked high priority. I read Adrian's first. Asterisk, full documentation is ready. There's one additional layer you need to see before you finalize anything. Asterisk. No details. Just that. I opened the second message. A meeting request. Internal review. Urgent. No names listed beyond the required. That was new. Before, everything came with context, too much of it. Explanations layered over explanations, designed to guide decisions before I even made them. Now, just facts. Or at least, the beginning of them. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I called Adrian. He answered on the second ring. "It's ready," he said, before I could speak. "I saw your message," I replied. "What's the additional layer?" A brief pause. Not hesitation. Preparation. "The part that doesn't sit inside the reports," he said. "The part that explains why none of this was questioned earlier." I leaned back slightly. "Go on." "It's not just structure," he continued. "It's culture. Patterns of approval. People signing off on things they didn't fully review because they trusted the process. Or the people controlling it." "Yes." Silence. Short. Focused. "How far does it go?" I asked. "Far enough that if you address it directly, it won't just be correction. It'll be disruption. It'll be exposure," he said. I considered that. Not the word itself. The weight behind it. "Send me everything," I said. "It's already on its way." I ended the call and waited. Not long. The file came through within minutes. Larger than anything he'd sent before. Not just numbers. Names. Approvals. Not surprised. Just clear. Because now, the decision in front of me wasn't about fixing a flaw. It was about redefining a system. My phone buzzed again. The meeting request. Still waiting. I accepted it. Asterisk 1 hour. Asterisk that gave me enough time. Not to prepare a reaction, but to decide a direction. When I walked into the room, it was already full. Not crowded, but complete. People who rarely sat at the same table were there now. Legal, finance, operations, all of them composed. All of them aware that something had shifted, even if they didn't yet know exactly what. I took my seat at the head of the table. No introduction, no formal opening, just presence. For a moment no one spoke. Then someone from legal began. "We've identified several areas that may require review." "We're past identification," I said calmly. The room went still. Not tense. Attentive. I placed the file on the table. Not sliding it toward anyone. Just setting it down. "Everything you're about to discuss is already here," I continued. "Documented. Cross-checked. Understood." A glance moved across the room. Subtle. Quick. "What we haven't discussed yet," I added, "is what happens next." That was the shift. Not in volume, in focus. Because until now, everything had been about the past. Now, it wasn't. "We can initiate a phased review," someone suggested. "Limit disruption while—" No, the word wasn't sharp. But it was final. "Phased reviews maintain the conditions that allowed this to exist," I said. "They don't change them." Silence followed. Longer this time. Because they understood the implication. "If we move too quickly," another voice said carefully, "there could be unintended consequences." "There are already consequences," I replied. "They've just been contained." I let that settle. Then continued. "This doesn't get contained anymore. No one interrupted. No one redirected. Because now, they weren't trying to manage the situation. They were listening to it. We're restructuring oversight," I said. "Full transparency across all approval chains. No isolated authority without direct accountability. I could see it in their expressions. Not resistance. Adjustment. Rapid. Measured. And the individuals involved, someone asked, will be evaluated based on actions, I said. Not assumptions. Not history. Actions. Another pause. Then a nod. Then another. Small. Controlled. But real. Because the direction was clear now. Not aggressive. Not reactive. Decisive. The meeting didn't last long after that. It didn't need to. The details would follow. The implementation would take time. But the shift, that had already happened. When I walked out of the room, the energy felt different from before. Not uncertain. Aligned. Not completely. But enough. Back in my office, I stood by the window, looking out over the city again. The same view. The same movement. But not the same position. Because a few weeks ago, everything I saw out there felt distant. Controlled by systems I didn't fully understand. Now, I understood them. Not perfectly. But enough to shape them. My phone buzzed one last time. A message. From my father. Short. Direct. We need to talk. I looked at it for a moment. Then set the phone down without replying. Not this time. Because now, the conversation wasn't going to happen on his terms. And it wasn't going to happen until I decided it should. I turned back to the table, to the documents, to the work that was no longer about uncovering or reacting. It was about building something that didn't rely on silence to function. Something that didn't require assumptions to hold. Something clear. And for the first time since all of this began, that future didn't feel uncertain. It felt intentional. I didn't respond to my father's message that day. Or the next. Not because I was avoiding it, but because I no longer felt the urgency he was trying to create. That was the difference now. Time wasn't something being used against me. It was something I controlled. The restructuring process moved forward faster than anyone expected. Not rushed. Just uninterrupted. Once clarity replaces assumption, things tend to move without resistance. There's less confusion to hide behind. Fewer places for delays to justify themselves. Reports became cleaner. Decisions became traceable. And conversations when they happened became shorter. More direct. Exactly the way they should have been from the beginning. Adrian stayed consistent. No hesitation. No attempts to reposition himself. Just execution. Which made him useful. Not trusted. Not yet. But useful. And for now, that was enough. A week passed before I finally decided to respond. Not with a call. A message. Tomorrow 6 p.m. No explanation. No location. He would understand. And he did. His reply came quickly. I'll be there. Of course he would. The house looked the same from the outside. Unchanged. Still quiet in that controlled, curated way that used to feel imposing. Now, it just looked contained. I arrived exactly at 6. Not early. Not late. The door opened before I knocked. My father stood there, composed as always, but not untouched, not anymore. Elena, he said. I stepped inside without responding. The air felt the same. Polished. Measured. Familiar in a way that didn't pull at me anymore. We moved to the sitting room. The same one where conversations used to feel one-sided. Where decisions were presented, not discussed. I sat first. That was new. He noticed. Of course he did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he did. "You've been busy." "Yes." A pause. "I've been reviewing what you've done," he continued. "The changes, the restructuring. I didn't ask how. I already knew. Information still moved. Just not the way it used to." "And?" I said. He exhaled slowly. "It's thorough, not praise. Acknowledgement. You didn't expect that," I replied. "I didn't expect you to move this quickly. I didn't expect to need to." Silence. But not empty. Measured. Then, finally, he leaned forward slightly. "What do you want from this?" The same question my uncle had asked. But this time, it carried something different. Less calculation. More clarity. "I want alignment," I said, "between what exists and how it's controlled. And you believe that wasn't already the case?" "I know it wasn't." He held my gaze. Longer this time. Not challenging. Not dismissing. Just looking. "You've changed," he said. "No," I replied. "I've stopped ignoring things." That landed. Because it wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. "And where does that leave us?" he asked. There it was. Not business. Not structure. US. I considered the question carefully. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because this was the first time it actually mattered how I said it. "It leaves us with clarity," I said finally. "That's not an answer." "It is," I replied calmly. "It just doesn't resolve anything on its own." Another pause. Then, "What are you asking for?" I shook my head slightly. "I'm not asking for anything." "Then what is this?" I met his gaze without hesitation. A boundary. That was the word that changed everything. Not control. Not power. Boundary. Because boundaries don't take. They define. "And if I don't agree with it?" he asked. "It doesn't require your agreement." Silence. Heavy this time. Not tense. But real. Because for the first time, there was nothing left to negotiate. He leaned back slowly, processing, adjusting, understanding something he hadn't needed to before. "You're serious," he said. "I've been serious." "No," he replied quietly. "This is different." I didn't respond, because he was right. This wasn't reaction anymore. This was position. "And your mother?" he asked after a moment. "What about her?" "She believes this can still be repaired." I let out a slow breath. "Repair requires acknowledgement," I said, "not just intention. And if that happens, then we see what's actually possible. Not a promise. Not a rejection. Just truth." The conversation didn't escalate after that. It didn't soften either. It just settled into something neither of us had experienced before. Honesty without control attached to it. When I stood to leave, he didn't stop me. Didn't try to extend the moment. "Elena," he said as I reached the door. I paused. "Not turning yet. You handled this well," he added. I looked back at him. For a second I considered responding. Then I didn't, because some acknowledgements don't need to be answered. I stepped outside. The air felt different here. Not because it had changed, but because I had. And as I walked away from the house, I realized something that hadn't been clear until now. This was the resolution. Not the kind that ties everything together neatly. Not the kind that restores what was there before. But the kind that leaves things exactly as they are. Visible. Defined. And real. I didn't lose anything. I stopped holding on to what was never stable to begin with. And in its place, I built something that didn't depend on anyone else to remain intact. Something quiet. Something deliberate. Something mine. And for the first time, that was enough. The next few weeks didn't feel dramatic. There were no confrontations waiting around corners. No sudden reversals. No hidden moves left to uncover. Just work. Steady. Structured. Intentional. And that was new. Because before, everything had felt like it was building towards something I couldn't see. Now, it felt like everything was finally moving in a direction I had chosen. The restructuring settled into place faster than expected. Not because it was simple, but because once transparency was established, resistance had nowhere to hold. People adapted. Some out of professionalism. Some out of necessity. And a few quietly out of respect. Not for me, not yet. But for the clarity of the system itself. Adrian became part of that system. Not central. Not trusted beyond his role. But consistent. Predictable in a way that made him reliable for now. And I learned something from that. Trust isn't given all at once. It's built in layers. Observed. Tested. Confirmed. Or not. One evening, as I was closing down for the day, I noticed something I hadn't seen in a while. No pending messages. No unresolved flags. No quiet inconsistencies waiting to be explained. Just stillness. Not the curated silence of the mansion. Real stillness. And I leaned back in my chair, letting that settle in for a moment. Because this was what everything had been moving toward. Not control. Not power. Stability. The kind that doesn't depend on who's watching. The kind that holds even when no one is. My phone buzzed lightly against the desk. A message. From my mother. Asterisk, can we meet? Asterisk. I read it once. Then again. Not searching for hidden meaning, just taking it as it was. Simple. Direct. Different. I didn't respond immediately. Not out of hesitation. But because I no longer reacted on impulse. That part of me was gone now. In its place. Something quieter. More deliberate. I set the phone down and finished organizing the last of the documents on my desk. Closed my laptop. Turned off the lights. Only then did I pick it back up. Tomorrow. Afternoon. Her reply didn't come right away. And for the first time, that didn't mean anything. The next day I chose the location. Not the house. Not the office. A neutral space. Quiet. Open. Without history attached to it. She arrived before I did. Sitting near the window. Hands folded loosely in front of her. Looking out like she was trying to find something in the distance. When I walked in, she turned. Stood. For a second, we just looked at each other. No performance. No pretense. Just recognition. Elena, she said softly. I nodded once and took the seat across from her. What did you want to talk about? I asked. No build-up, no easing into it. She exhaled slowly. Not nervous. Careful. I've been thinking, she said, about everything that's happened. I didn't interrupt. I know I said we were trying to protect you, she continued. And I know how that sounded. It sounded incomplete, I replied. She nodded slightly. It was. Silence. But not uncomfortable. Just honest. For a long time, she went on, things were handled a certain way. Decisions were made quickly, quietly, without much discussion. I know. And when your grandfather started putting things in place for you, it changed the balance. I held her gaze. And instead of adjusting to that, she said, We tried to maintain what we were used to. That's one way to describe it. A faint, almost tired smile touched her expression. It's the most accurate way I can say it right now. I let that sit for a moment. Because this wasn't about correcting her wording. It was about whether she understood what she was saying. And now? I asked. She looked down briefly, then back at me. Now I'm trying to understand what comes next, she said. Not asterisk fix it asterisk. Not asterisk undo it asterisk. Understand. That mattered. What comes next? I said slowly. Depends on what's acknowledged. She didn't look away. I'm listening. Another small shift. Not dramatic. But real. So I didn't rush it. Didn't fill the space with more than it needed. For anything to move forward, I said, there has to be a clear understanding of what actually happened. Not just intentions. Not just explanations. Actions, she said quietly. Yes. She nodded once, then again. Like she was aligning something internally. I can do that, she said. I studied her for a moment. Not searching for doubt. Just observing. Because this wasn't about believing immediately. It was about seeing what followed. We'll see, I replied. Not dismissive. Not encouraging. Just honest. The conversation didn't stretch beyond that. It didn't need to. Because this wasn't resolution. It was a beginning. A different kind. When we stood to leave, there was no awkwardness. No forced closure. Just a pause. And in that pause, something quieter than forgiveness. Something more grounded than trust. Possibility. I walked out into the afternoon light, the city moving around me in its usual rhythm. Nothing had changed out there, but something had shifted again. Not in structure, not in control, in direction. Because for the first time, the future didn't feel like something I had to secure alone. It felt like something that could be built, carefully, deliberately, with boundaries that didn't move, and clarity that didn't fade. I didn't know exactly what that would look like yet, and for once, I didn't need to, because I wasn't trying to predict it anymore. I was ready to define it, one decision at a time. The following days didn't rush forward. They unfolded, not with urgency but with intention. For the first time since everything began, there was no pressure to react, no hidden layer waiting to be uncovered, no urgency disguised as importance. Just decisions, clear ones, and the space to make them properly. My mother kept her word, not in a dramatic way. Not all at once, but consistently. Documents were reviewed. Conversations happened. Acknowledgements were made, some difficult, some overdue. There were moments where the past tried to reassert itself. Old habits, old tones, subtle attempts to guide outcomes instead of accepting them. But they didn't last, because clarity doesn't disappear once you've seen it. And I wasn't going back to not seeing. The system stabilized. Not perfectly, but honestly. And that made all the difference. Weeks turned into months. The structure I had rebuilt started to feel less like something I was managing, and more like something that simply functioned. Without tension. Without silence hiding things beneath it. Just working. Adrian remained where he was. Steady. Accountable. He never asked for trust, and I never offered it freely. But over time, something else replaced that gap. Consistency. And sometimes that's more valuable. My uncle stepped back, not publicly, not dramatically, but noticeably. Less involved, less certain. Because the space he once moved through without resistance no longer existed. and he knew it. My father adjusted in his own way. Not openly, not with words, but in how he engaged. No more assumptions. No more decisions made in advance of conversation. It wasn't transformation, but it was change. And sometimes, that's enough. One evening, months later, I found myself back at the coast. The same place my grandfather had taken me years ago. The same terrace. The same view stretching endlessly over the water. I stood there quietly, the wind moving gently through the air, carrying that familiar stillness that used to feel like a lesson I didn't fully understand. Now, I did. I thought about everything that had happened, not as a series of conflicts, but as a series of realizations. Every moment that felt uncertain, every decision that felt heavier than it should have, every time I had to choose between staying comfortable and seeing clearly. And I realized something simple. None of it was about taking control from anyone else. It was about taking responsibility for what was already mine. Responsibility to see, to question, to act. Not out of reaction, but out of understanding. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folded note my grandfather had given me all those years ago. The edges were worn now, but the words were still clear. If they rush you, don't trust them. I smiled slightly, not because it felt like a warning anymore, but because it had become something else. A reminder of where this started and why it mattered. I folded it carefully and placed it back, then looked out at the horizon one more time. There was no final revelation waiting there. No dramatic ending. Just quiet certainty. Because the truth is, not every story ends with everything fixed. Some stories end with everything understood. And that's what this was. Not an ending. A foundation. Something steady. Something clear. Something that didn't depend on anyone else to hold its shape. I turned and walked away from the terrace slowly, not looking back this time, because I didn't need to. Everything I needed to carry forward, I already had. And if you stayed with this story until the end, then you understand something most people overlook. Clarity changes everything. So if this story made you think, if it pulled you in, or if it reminded you of something real, make sure to subscribe. Share this story with someone who needs it. Like the video, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Because sometimes the stories we connect with the most are the ones that show us what we were finally ready to see.